Setting the stage. The Roaring Twenties. Imagine this. It's the mid-1920s in America. Jazz clubs are booming, radios are blaring, and cars are suddenly everywhere. People are wearing flapper dresses and sharp suits, smoking long cigarettes, and dancing the Charleston under glittering lights. The First World War is over, and the mood is pure optimism on steroids. The United States is the richest country in the world now. Factories hum day and night. Cities are growing taller with steel skyscrapers, and rural America is being pulled into the modern age by automobiles, telephones, and electricity. Money is flowing, or at least it feels that way. Ordinary folks who never dreamed of investing are now hearing about the stock market at the dinner table. Bank clerks, barbers, and school teachers are suddenly traders in their spare time. Newspapers are full of success stories. A taxi driver buys a few shares of a car company and triples his money in a year. Secretaries invest in radio companies and make more than their bosses. A bootlegger cashes out and starts a real estate empire. It feels like magic. But of course, magic has a way of disappearing. The stock market boomed from 1924 to 1929. The Dow Jones Industrial Average more than quadruples. People start buying on margin, meaning they borrow money to buy stocks. With just $10 of your own, you can buy $100 worth of shares. Sounds amazing, right? Until prices stop going up, and there's this unspoken belief. Stocks can't go down for long. Spoiler alert, oh, they can. The fever before the fall, the illusion of endless growth by the late 1920s. It felt like the stock market was a magic money machine. Average Americans, who had never cared about Wall Street before, were suddenly talking about buying on margin over dinner. Bank clerks, taxi drivers, teachers, all had little stacks of stock certificates. Newspapers breathlessly reported daily gains. Companies like RCA Radio Corporation of America were skyrocketing without even paying dividends. It was pure speculative mania. In cities like New York and Chicago, brokerage houses opened, stock market parlors, like mini theaters, where people could sit in rows watching the ticker tape roll in. The room would burst into cheers if a favorite stock rose a few points. But here's the catch. Margin buying meant that you could put down just 10% of a stock's price and borrow the rest. Example, you could buy $10,000 worth of stock with only $1,000 cash. If the stock went up, huge profits. But if it fell, you owed the full loss. And the broker could demand the money immediately. A castle built on credit. This by now, pay later spirit wasn't just in the stock market, it was everywhere. Families bought cars and radios on installment plans. Businesses expanded using bank loans, assuming the good times would never end. Even farmers borrowed heavily to buy tractors and land. The U.S. economy was like a mansion with glittering chandeliers, but built on a shaky foundation of debt. The summer heat wave of 1929 in early 1929. Some smart voices started warning. Roger Babson, an economist, famously said, "Sooner or later, a crash is coming, and it may be terrific." Wall Street laughed him off. Stocks kept climbing. The summer was hot, literally and financially. The Dow Jones Industrial Average hit a record high in early September. But beneath the surface, steel production was slowing. Car sales were dipping. Construction projects were being canceled. The public didn't notice. They were too busy believing the party would never end. The first tremors. September 1929. On September 3, 1929, the Dow peaked at 381 points, a record that would not be broken until the mid-1950s. From there, the slide began. It started small, a dip here, a small drop there. But traders whispered about big investors quietly selling their holdings. By late September, bad economic news from Britain, a surprise interest rate hike, shook investor confidence. Selling began to outpace buying. The week that changed everything, Black Thursday, October 24, 1929. It began like any other trading day. But soon, a tidal wave of selling orders hit the market. 12.9 million shares traded. A record. Prices plunged. Brokers' phones rang nonstop with panicked calls. A group of big bankers, the money men of Wall Street, met in a secret room at the J.P. Morgan & Co. offices. They decided to pour millions into blue-chip stocks to calm the panic. For a moment, it worked. Prices rebounded slightly by the afternoon. But the fear wasn't gone. It was just hiding. Black Monday, October 28, 1929, the following Monday, panic returned. Harder. Prices plunged again. The Dow fell nearly 13% in one day. People outside the New York Stock Exchange gathered, staring at the big board, speechless. Bank messengers sprinted through the streets with urgent orders. Black Tuesday, October 29, 1929. This was the day the music truly stopped. 16.4 million shares changed hands. The ticker tape ran hours behind. People didn't even know how bad it was until after the market closed. Fortunes evaporated in hours. Millionaires became paupers by dinner time. Some investors were so crushed financially and emotionally that tragic suicides were reported. One newspaper cruelly joked, "Window cleaners of Wall Street are working overtime." The dominoes fall October 24th to 29th, 1929. By late October 1929, the market's mood had gone from a jittery shuffle to an all-out panic dance. Newspapers were crammed with headlines about price drops. Brokers were pacing the floor in sweat-soaked collars. And ordinary citizens, some of whom had never owned a single share before the 1920s, were now realizing their paper fortunes were turning to dust. October 24th, 1929. Black Thursday. The morning started like any other. But by the first bell, it was clear something was wrong. The selling orders poured in faster than the ticker tape could print. The air on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange was thick, not just with cigarette smoke, but with the heat of hundreds of frantic brokers shouting prices, waving slips of paper, and making desperate phone calls. By 11 a.m., the market had plunged so sharply that the most influential bankers in America decided to stage a rescue. A group of them, including Thomas W. Lamont of J.P. Morgan & Co., gathered in a private meeting room high above Wall Street. They emerged with a plan. The banks would use their immense capital to buy large blocks of blue-chip stocks at above-market prices to restore confidence. And for a moment, it worked. The market stabilized. The crowd on the floor relaxed a little. Outside, reporters shouted, "The bankers have stepped in." People hoped this was just a temporary dip, but the panic wasn't over. October 28, 1929, Black Monday. The following Monday was brutal. The market fell like a stone tossed in the ocean, nearly 13% in a single day. Telegraph lines and phone exchanges were overloaded with calls from brokers and investors across the country. In small towns, local banks faced lines of worried customers demanding to withdraw their savings, fearing they'd be next to collapse. The worst part, the rescue attempt on Black Thursday had convinced some investors to hold on just long enough to be caught in this new wave of losses. October 29, 1929, Black Tuesday. This was the day the music died for the Roaring Twenties. When the opening bell rang, it wasn't just panic, it was chaos. Over 16 million shares changed hands that day, a record at the time. The prices for iconic companies U.S. Steel, General Electric, Westinghouse fell so fast that brokers couldn't find buyers at any price. The ticker tape was hours behind the actual trades. So by the time investors read the latest numbers, the reality was already far worse. Crowds gathered outside the stock exchange, not just to trade, but to watch. The fall of Wall Street had become a public spectacle. Police were stationed outside banks and brokerage firms to prevent fights or worse. By the end of the day, billions in wealth had vanished. The nation was stunned. Why it hit so hard? It's important to remember. The crash didn't just hurt wealthy investors, it hit ordinary people, too. Farmers who had borrowed to buy tractors and equipment found themselves unable to pay back loans when crop prices fell. Factory workers lost jobs as companies cut production. Small banks collapsed when they couldn't recover loans made to now bankrupt businesses. The stock market crash was a spark, but the fire that followed would burn for years. The Great Depression. The ripple across the world. When the New York Stock Exchange crumbled in 1929, it didn't just take down Wall Street. It sent shockwaves that rattled the very bones of the global economy. The United States, by this time, wasn't some isolated country minding its own business. It was a rising giant, deeply tangled in international trade, loans, and investments. So when America caught a cold, the rest of the world, well, they didn't just sneeze, they fell sick. 1. America's heart stops, and the world feels it after the crash. Banks in the U.S. began failing, one after another. People rushed to withdraw their savings, and many walked away empty-handed. But here's the kicker. American banks weren't just holding the savings of U.S. citizens. They were also holding the debts and investments of foreign countries. Throughout the 1920s, the U.S. had been loaning money to nations like Germany, which was still paying reparations from World War I. Britain and France were relying on Germany's payments to pay back their own debts to America. This was a fragile chain and the crash broke it instantly. 2. Germany. From crisis to collapse, Germany was already struggling under the heavy weight of war reparations. The American loans it depended on were suddenly gone. Factories slowed. Unemployment soared. The political chaos deepened. It was in this fertile ground of desperation that extremist movements, including Adolf Hitler's Nazi Party, found their audience. If you've ever wondered how a country could turn so quickly toward dictatorship, the economic collapse of 1929 is a big part of that answer. 3. Britain, a pound under pressure. Britain, still clinging to its empire, had been trying to restore the gold standard to stabilize its currency. But after the crash, global trade shrank, exports fell, and Britain's unemployment rate began climbing toward record highs. The proud empire was finding out that prestige didn't put food on the table. 4. France. Late to feel the pain, France initially seemed to dodge the worst of the storm. Its economy was more agricultural, less dependent on the New York markets. But global trade eventually slowed enough to pull France into the downturn, and by the early 1930s, it too was dealing with joblessness, strikes, and political unrest. 5. The domino effect in the colonies. Europe's colonies stretching across Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean weren't immune either. The prices of raw materials like rubber, cocoa, and coffee collapsed. Farmers who had relied on export markets were ruined. In places like British India, the economic strain fueled new waves of anti-colonial sentiment. 6. The Great Depression is born. By 1930, what started as a stock market crash had morphed into the Great Depression, the deepest, longest economic downturn in modern history. Factories closed, farms failed, families lost homes. In America, unemployment would eventually hit nearly 25%. In Germany, it reached over 30%. 7. How it shaped the future. This wasn't just an economic event, it reshaped history. It influenced politics, gave rise to new ideologies, and set the stage for World War II. And it taught the world a brutal lesson about the dangers of speculation, unregulated markets, and the fragility of global connections. Aftershocks across generations. 1. The long shadow of the crash. When the ticker tapes stopped and the panic settled into silence, America did not wake up to a quick recovery. Instead, the 1929 crash left a scar on the national psyche. For an entire generation, the word stocks became almost taboo in polite conversation. Ordinary people, especially those who had lost life savings, began to associate Wall Street with gambling dens rather than an engine of prosperity. Families that had lived through it often carried the trauma quietly, refusing to take financial risks for decades. Europe watched closely. London, Paris, Berlin, all felt the tremors. Germany, already crippled by Versailles reparations and hyperinflation in the early 1920s, saw its fragile recovery collapse. In Britain, unemployment surged in industrial cities like Liverpool and Glasgow. Across the continent, the political center weakened, paving the way for extremist ideologies. 2. How it changed the American way of life. The crash forced America into a new kind of realism. The jazz age had been about excess, but now, people saved scraps of string, reused jars, and made do with patched clothes. Luxury was no longer a matter of champagne and pearls. It was a full meal and a paid mortgage. Home gardens popped up in cities. Many urban Americans began bartering services. ILL, fix your roof if you fix my car. Advertising shifted tone. In the 1920s, ads flaunted glamour and excitement. In the 1930s, they promised durability, thrift, and reliability, the kind of values people now demanded. 3. The political domino effect. The economic chaos unleashed by the crash reshaped political landscapes in both America and Europe. In the USA, Herbert Hoover, president at the time, was blamed for inaction. His belief in rugged individualism, that people should lift themselves without government aid, felt out of touch. Franklin D. Roosevelt rose to power in 1932 with a bold promise: the New Deal, massive public works programs, banking reforms like the Glass-Steagall Act to separate commercial and investment banking, Social Security to provide a safety net for the elderly and unemployed. In Europe, in Germany, the crash deepened desperation. With unemployment soaring, extremist parties gained followers, setting the stage for Adolf Hitler's rise in 1933. In Britain, the crisis weakened the pound, forcing the country off the gold standard in 1931. France and Italy wrestled with political instability as governments rose and fell within months. For global trade breakdown, the crash didn't just stay in New York. It tore through the world economy like wildfire. International lending dried up overnight. American banks, now crippled, recalled loans from Europe. Global trade collapsed as nations erected tariffs to protect their industries. The infamous Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, 1930, in the USA, raised import duties, triggering retaliation from other nations. Instead of protecting jobs, it worsened unemployment globally. By 1932, world trade had fallen by 2/3, compared to 1929. Factories closed, ships sat idle in harbors, and agricultural goods rotted unsold. 5. The human toll. The numbers are staggering, but the real story was written in the lives of everyday people. In America, unemployment reached nearly 25% by 1933. Dust Bowl migrants, fleeing drought in the Midwest, flooded California looking for work. Inspiring John Steinbeck's novel, The Grapes of Wrath, breadlines and soup kitchens became a daily sight in major cities. In Europe, Germany's unemployment rate soared to over 30%, deepening anger against the Weimar government. In Britain, hunger marches took place, such as the Jarrow Crusade of 1936, where jobless workers walked over 300 miles to London. 6. Psychological effects. Perhaps one of the most underappreciated impacts of the crash was its mental toll. The fear of losing everything became ingrained. Many who lived through it carried frugality to the grave. Some survivors became financial hoarders, hiding cash in mattresses rather than trusting banks. For young people, the crash was a lesson that the world could change overnight, a reminder to always have a Plan B. 7. Lessons learned and forgotten. In the wake of the disaster, reforms tried to prevent another collapse. The Securities and Exchange Commission (SEC) was created in 1934 to regulate the stock market. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation (FDIC) protected bank deposits. Margin requirements for buying stocks were tightened to reduce dangerous speculation. But human memory is short. By the 1980s and 90s, deregulation returned, and echoes of the 1929 crash would be heard again in events like the 2008 financial crisis. 8. The cultural legacy. The crash changed art, literature, and film. Hollywood shifted from lavish musicals to gritty dramas. I Am a Fugitive from a Chain Gang. 1932. Jazz became more melancholic, reflecting the times. Writers like Steinbeck, Fitzgerald, and Langston Hughes captured the disillusionment and resilience of the era. Closing thoughts. The 1929 stock market crash wasn't just a bad week on Wall Street. It was a turning point in modern history. It ended the glittering optimism of the 1920s, reshaped politics, fueled extremism in Europe, and redefine the relationship between governments and their citizens. It's a story not only of loss and ruin, but also of how societies adapt, sometimes painfully, to a new reality.